So the good news is that a lot of these initiatives are working with weathercasters so that they can get that extra training on climate change, so that now the skepticism is decreasing, which is very encouraging. And the role of Congress just means that there are a lot of weathercasters who identified as politically conservative and came out to their colleagues and said, this is not an issue of ideology, it's an issue of science. And so over time, this has improved, and so that's very encouraging. So the last part of this, I said a three-part to this lecture, is kind of what has happened now with the doubt industry that has formed about skepticism. So when I started my PhD in 1989, oh my God, that's 40 years. I just had this realization, I don't know, wow. No, it's 30 years. That's, oh. Wow. 30 is still a lot, but I was like, and what kind of sparked this research was a headline in the local Boulder paper. And it said, scientists say there's no greenhouse effect. What? If there's no greenhouse effect, we're screwed. Because that's the only thing that allows life on this planet. Okay? Mars doesn't have a greenhouse effect. It's inhospitable to life. Okay? So the greenhouse effect is one of the most established theories in all of science. There's no debate among scientists. But it just showed that in this case, the reporter, or most likely the headline writer, got confused and used incorrect terminology. And so using precise language is really important. So this takes us back to Bob Jensen's lecture about the choice of words. So in 2002, I got invited to present some research to the National Association of Science Writers. That's what NASW stands for. It was a packed room, including reporters for the New York Times and some of the biggest papers, and CNN was there. And I got a chance to work with them to talk about using precise language. And the idea was to move beyond calling it global warming, because global warming is really only one possible impact. When we're talking about what's happening, is there's a range of impacts that are happening, and temperature, in some cases, may not even be the most important one. So I worked with reporters to use better language, more precise language. But at the same time I was doing this and working with reporters, the Bush White House was working on their own messaging, which was they found internal research that said that climate change is a less frightening term to use than global warming, and so that whenever they talked about it, they should use the term climate change. It was an internal memo that didn't come out until like 6 years later. Okay? So at the very same time, I'm working with journalists to try to use good language, precise language. At the same time, there was a messaging campaign happening and using the term because it's perceived to be less threatening than global warming. All right, so let's talk about that article that you read about Exxon from Inside Climate News. Pretty amazing research there, right? It tells us that Exxon stressed uncertainty for, this would be 40 years because it started in the 1970s, for decades to sow doubt about climate change, right? So this Inside Climate News, whoops, this article that I had you read was a collaboration with LA Times and Inside Climate News, and I thought it was a really pretty damning piece of research, right? Again, a whistleblower. We've seen the role of a whistleblower so many times in the reporting. So there's very detailed reporting about how Exxon tried to influence policy. And I love this line in the story. They turned ordinary scientific uncertainties into weapons of mass confusion. So playing off that idea of weapons of mass destruction. So they took ordinary science uncertainties. So we've talked some about this. Why can't science be certain for us? Okay, this weather forecast today, a week ago the local forecasters were predicting it. It's remarkably accurate. A week ago they said we're going to have probably a pretty big storm system a week from today on Wednesday. A week ago you couldn't say exactly where it was going to happen or what time it was going to happen, but you could tell that the ingredients were coming together. But there's still going to be uncertainty. What this article tells us is they turned these uncertainties into weapons of mass confusion. So here's what I think we want to take from it. that as early as the 1970s and into the 1980s, Exxon scientists told executives that burning of fossil fuels was creating climate change. And that they had that really great infographic in there to look at. That's another thing Robert Quigley was talking about, is using all of the new tools that we can. I thought it was a really good way to contrast them. And the research tells us that in the mid-80s, Exxon was even working with the Department of Energy on a climate change report. So I'll ask the question again, what the hell happened? Exxon scientists knew 40 years ago that what they were doing in burning of fossil fuels was contributing to the warming of the planet by putting greenhouse gases. And then what happened? Well, it's called the doubt industry, right? Let's create doubt about the science. Because there's going to be uncertainties. If you can play up the uncertainties, then you can make some people feel like, well, then if we don't know for sure, we can't do anything, right? And in fact, they took this right from the tobacco company's playbook. Tobacco companies knew for decades that their product was causing cancer and killing people. And they denied it publicly, and they said, we don't know for sure, we need more research. Meanwhile, they knew exactly what was happening. That's pretty despicable, isn't it? To know that you're creating a product internally that you know is making people sick, and you still do it to make money. Same thing here, right? And Exxon gets the focus of this particular story, but since that time, it's turned out that Shell has internal documents like this too. So they knew all along. So I want to show another clip. I think I've shown you clips from like 20 different journalism-related movies over the course of the semester. Here's another one to add to your list, Merchants of Doubt. It's a documentary written by Naomi Oreskes. A book was written by her. And it's an hour and a half, and I'm just going to show you a quick 10-minute clip because I think it's really important to understand what's behind the creation of all this uncertainty.
At the same time, O'Keefe is a lobbyist for ExxonMobil. He's also
When I was at Greenpeace, we started to look into who was funding these think tanks. And you started to find ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers and the Southern Company.
ExxonMobil has been a major funder of climate change disinformation. They funded over 30 different organizations that promoted disinformation or misleading information about the issue of climate change.
Once we got reporters...
Nobody's going to believe ExxonMobil. But if they can say it through somebody else who seems independent, then there's power in that for them.
Myron Ebell is Director of Energy and Global Warming Policy for the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
He's Senior Fellow and Science Director of the Heartland Institute.
The idea that cooling...
It creates a whole new cast of characters, these people who become well known for casting doubt on global warming.
Dr. Marlo Lewis, a Senior Fellow at the Competitive...
What these institutes then do is they promote their own experts as contrary experts who can give you the other side of the issue. And journalists fall for it. They fall for it lock, stock, and barrel.
Let's talk to a couple of experts, shall we? Joining us now from...
Scientists will be invited to explain the science, and then, against the scientists, they will have a so-called expert from a think tank. And so the public is presented with dueling experts.
Stephen Zebiak is General Director of International Research Institute in Climate and Society at Columbia University. James Taylor is a Senior Fellow at the Conservative Heartland Institute, the group.
But if you actually ask what are their credentials, the answer is often very little and sometimes none.
The thing that Mark Burano says at the end is that they're not intending to pass any legislation, they just want to stop anything from happening. By sowing doubt, by creating uncertainty where there isn't, if they can create confusion among us as the public, then nothing will happen. So Scott Pruitt is no longer our EPA chief. And as we saw earlier in the semester, reasons why, because of his excesses. He said carbon dioxide is not a contributor to climate change. He's the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, was. So these are the points I really wanted to get to sum up. So with all of this, as journalists, it's really important for us to remember to monitor power. And as the fourth estate, we talked about monitoring the 3 branches of the government. That's not just the whole thing, right? We monitor all kinds of power. That's what's expected of us from the First Amendment. In this case, it means monitoring the impacts of corporations, the roles of senators, people who have power to make rules and regulations. So we've looked at these discrete events about how journalism has made a difference, right? Watergate, civil rights movement, McCarthyism. I think this is our moment. I think this is the issue for our time. Can journalists rise to the occasion and get cut through all this noise, the clutter, the doubt industry? These examples from Mark Morano I think are really telling, because we've talked about what happens on cable and trying to present someone like him as a credible expert when he's got an invested interest, but he doesn't show us that up front. We have to avoid this dueling scientist scenario. So we heard Naomi Oreskes, who's the author of this book, Emergence of Doubt. She gets interviewed in the documentary. She says, oh, it looks like you've got dueling scientists. You've got a scientist over here with credentials, and here's someone else who has some kind of credentials, but they're not the same. I mean, we heard James Taylor telling us he took a couple of atmospheric classes, and he thinks that makes him qualified to talk about climate in the way that climate scientists can. And what happens when we do this, when we put dueling scientists, is we create what I call an ersatz balance, okay? It's not balanced if one side is 98% of scientists agree, and we have less than that, 1 or 2% who disagree. If we have a story that we report that's 50-50, and we give equal time, we balance it, then we're doing a disservice, right? Because we're not representing the scientific evidence. So I put this in bold. I put this with multiple asterisks. The thing that I want you to take from this is the idea of using weight of evidence reporting, okay? It doesn't mean we don't include a skeptic in our story. You know, we talked about this. We don't need to interview somebody from the Flat Earth Society. I mean, we do not have a flat Earth. There's just no reason to include that, right? I mean, look at it. It's round, right? I love Amy Sanders' comment last week, is that she said, we don't need to talk to deniers anymore in our stories. I was like, yeah, you heard me over there, whoop, yeah. I mean, the time has come, actually, for us as journalists to reflect the weight of scientific evidence and not have this ersatz balance of 50-50. And putting 2 scientists, presumably at odds with each other, just because it creates conflict. Because what it does then, it ends up creating some confusion for the audience. All right, we've got time for a couple of questions, and then I wanted to. So think about your questions, and then I want to see what's the latest with our radar. Oh, it's already gone over us. We've been in here the whole time, and we missed it. Wow.